You never really know what goes on behind closed doors. To their neighbors, Elaine and Thomas Price were just another quiet couple in a small Texas town. A nice house, well-kept lawn, polite smiles at the grocery store. But if you listen closely enough, through the walls, past the silence, you might have heard it, the sound of loneliness, the kind of emptiness that turns love into routine and a home into a prison. And one night, that silence was shattered. Before we get into the truth of what happened, let me say this. You don't want to watch this one until the very end, because nothing in this story is what it seems. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe, because this is only the beginning. Now, let's go back to where it all started. Elaine Price was 34, beautiful in a quiet way that came from kindness rather than vanity. She worked at the local library, the kind of woman who remembered the names of the children who came in for story hour. But at home, she was invisible. Thomas, her husband of 10 years, used to bring her flowers. He used to notice the way she laughed. But somewhere between long hours at his construction business and his obsession with money, he'd stopped looking at her at all. To him, Elaine was dependable, predictable, a piece of furniture in the house he never really lived in. And that's when she met him. He called himself Jonah. He was a drifter, the kind of man who carried his life in a worn leather backpack and spoke with the ease of someone who'd never belonged anywhere long enough to be trapped. Elaine met him on a rainy Tuesday, of all days, when he came into the library looking for nothing in particular. "Is there somewhere I can sit for a while?" he'd asked, his voice low but warm. Something in his tone, something in the way he looked at her, like she wasn't invisible, made her say yes. That was how it began. A stranger and a neglected wife, sitting across from each other in the quiet hum of fluorescent lights and rain-soaked windows. And that was the first time in years Elaine felt seen. It didn't happen all at once. Jonah came back, day after day, always with a new story. Places he'd been, things he'd seen, a kind of freedom Elaine couldn't imagine. He had rough hands, sun-browned skin, and eyes that carried secrets. She didn't mean for it to happen. She told herself it was just conversation, just a friend. But late at night, lying next to Thomas, while he scrolled through his phone in silence, she'd think about Jonah's laugh, about how he noticed the way her eyes lit up when she talked about books. And then one afternoon, when the library was empty and the storm outside raged so loudly it drowned out the world, Jonah kissed her. For the first time in a decade, Elaine felt alive. They became careful, meetings stolen in quiet corners, whispered phone calls when Thomas was at work. But in small towns, secrets don't stay buried for long. Thomas wasn't a stupid man. At first, it was the little things. The way Elaine smiled at her phone. How she started wearing the perfume he'd bought her years ago, but had never noticed. Then one night, Thomas came home early. Elaine was in the shower. Her phone was on the counter, and one unread message lit up the screen. "I miss you. I can't stop thinking about you. Jay." That was all it took. Thomas didn't confront her. Not at first. He watched. He waited. He followed her one afternoon, just far enough to see her car parked outside the library when it should have been closed. And he saw Jonah. That night, Thomas didn't sleep. He sat at the kitchen table in the dark, staring at the bottle of whiskey in front of him, his knuckles white around the glass. He didn't shout. He didn't cry. He planned. Elaine had no idea. She thought Thomas was just tired, distracted, the same as always. She told herself he didn't care enough to notice her affair. She was wrong, because a week later, Jonah disappeared. Elaine called his number. No answer. She went by the spot near the old train tracks where they sometimes met. Nothing. It was as if he'd vanished into thin air. Until 2 nights later, there was a knock at her door. When Elaine opened it, there was Thomas, and in his hand, Jonah's backpack. "Where did you get this?" Her voice cracked, but Thomas only smiled. "You should have stayed in your lane, Elaine," he said quietly. Her blood went cold. "What did you do?" Thomas didn't answer. He didn't have to, because in that moment, Elaine understood 2 things. Jonah wasn't coming back, and her husband was not the man she thought he was. But then Thomas leaned in, his voice low enough to cut through the pounding in her ears. You think you can embarrass me in this town? You think you can make me the fool?" Elaine stumbled backward, fear twisting in her gut. "Where is he?" Thomas smiled again, slow and cruel. "Gone. And if you don't want the same thing to happen to you, you'll keep your mouth shut." But Elaine wasn't the same woman she used to be. Jonah had awakened something in her, a spark, a defiance that Thomas hadn't counted on. She didn't call the police. Not right away. She played her part. She cooked dinner. She smiled. She acted like the obedient wife Thomas had always wanted. But late at night, when he was asleep, she searched, and what she found changed everything. In the glove compartment of Thomas's truck, tucked beneath an old receipt, was a key with an address scratched into a piece of paper. Elaine didn't sleep that night. She waited until Thomas left for work the next morning, then drove, and there it was, a storage unit. Her hands trembled as she turned the key. The door screeched as it opened, and inside was Jonah's jacket, his boots, and something far worse, a blood-stained hammer. Elaine's breath hitched, her vision blurred. She wanted to scream, but nothing came out. Behind her, the sound of gravel crunching under tires. She turned. Thomas's truck. He was standing there, watching her, and this time he wasn't smiling. Thomas stood there at the edge of the gravel lot, hands tucked in his jacket pockets, like a man who had all the time in the world. His eyes were calm, too calm. That was the part that terrified Elaine most. "Close the door," he said, his voice low. Elaine's heart pounded in her chest, but her hands wouldn't move. She was frozen, standing between her husband and the bloody proof of what he'd done. "Thomas," her voice cracked. "What is this? What did you—" He stepped closer, slow, deliberate. "Shut it, Elaine. Right now." For the first time in 10 years, she didn't obey him. Instead, she took a single step back, deeper into the storage unit, her foot brushing against Jonah's jacket lying crumpled on the concrete floor. And Thomas noticed. He tilted his head, his lips curling into something that wasn't quite a smile. "You should have left it alone," he whispered. Elaine's hands shook as she fumbled for her phone, but before she could even unlock it, Thomas lunged. His hand closed around her wrist, the strength in his grip making her cry out. "Stop it," he hissed. "You think anyone's gonna believe you? You think you're gonna take my life and burn it to the ground because of him?" He was nothing. "Let me go," she screamed, the sound raw in the empty lot. Thomas yanked the phone from her hand and threw it into the gravel. It shattered, and then, in the quiet that followed, he said something that made her blood run cold. He begged Elaine, "Just like you will if you don't shut your mouth." For a split second, the world tilted. Elaine saw Jonah's laugh, the way he'd looked at her like she mattered. And then she saw Thomas, the man who once promised to love her, standing there with the darkness in his eyes, so deep it felt like falling. She didn't think. She ran. Her feet hit the gravel hard, sharp stones tearing through her shoes. Thomas cursed behind her, his boots pounding against the ground, faster, closer. Elaine reached her car and yanked the door open, but before she could slam it shut, his hand caught the frame. His face was inches from hers, twisted with rage. "You don't walk away from me," he growled. And for the first time in her life, Elaine fought back. She shoved the door with every ounce of strength she had. It slammed against his arm, and he roared in pain. She didn't wait. She threw the car in reverse and tore out of that lot, gravel spitting behind her tires. In the rearview mirror, Thomas stood there, holding his arm, watching her go. And he was smiling. Not the smile of a man who'd lost. The smile of a man who knew this wasn't over. Elaine didn't go home. She couldn't. Not with Thomas out there. Instead, she drove to the one place she thought she'd be safe, the police station. But when she told them everything, about Jonah, about the storage unit, about the hammer, they looked at her like she was unraveling. "Mrs. Price," the officer said slowly, "you've been under a lot of stress. Maybe this Jonah person wasn't who you thought he was." They didn't believe her. Thomas had been in this town for years. He coached Little League. He donated to the church roof fund. He was the kind of man people trusted. And Elaine? She was just a lonely wife with the wild story. That night, she checked into a motel on the edge of town. She locked the door. She pushed a chair under the handle. And still she couldn't sleep. Because just before dawn, her backup phone she'd hidden in her purse, buzzed with a single text. No name, no number, just 5 words. You can't hide from me. By the time the sun came up, Elaine had made her choice. If no one else would help her, she would help herself. She drove back to that storage unit, her hands trembling on the wheel, a kitchen knife hidden under the seat. She didn't care if she was terrified. She didn't care if Thomas was there. She was going to open that door again. And this time, she was going to find out the truth. But when she slid the key into the lock, her stomach dropped, because the door was already open. And inside, the storage unit was empty. Not just of Jonah's things. Empty, except for a single Polaroid taped to the wall. Elaine's hand shook as she peeled it off and turned it over. It was a photo of her, asleep, in her motel room, and scrawled across the bottom in thick black ink. Next, Elaine stood frozen in the doorway of the storage unit, the Polaroid trembling in her hand. Her own sleeping face stared back at her, the inked word next clawing at her mind like a warning. He'd been there, inside her motel room, watching her. A scream built in her throat, but never made it out. Instead, her breath came in short, panic gasps, her pulse roaring in her ears. She looked over her shoulder, expecting, no, knowing, Thomas was near. But the lot was empty. For now. Elaine's hands shook as she backed away from the storage unit. The photo still clutched tight. She didn't even lock the door. She ran for her car, slammed it into gear, and drove until the roads blurred. She didn't go back to the motel. She couldn't. Thomas wanted her afraid, trapped like a deer in headlights. But if she'd learned anything in the past week, it was this. Fear was useless unless you turned it into a weapon. That night, Elaine parked behind an abandoned gas station miles outside town. She killed the lights and sat in silence, gripping the steering wheel until her knuckles ached. Think, she whispered to herself. Jonah's face flashed in her mind, his laugh, his kindness, and then the bloody hammer in the storage unit. She couldn't undo what Thomas had done, but she wasn't going to be his next victim. She was done running. If Thomas wanted a game, he was about to find out she knew how to play. The first thing she did was stop being predictable. No more motel rooms. No more routines he could track. She used the last of her savings to buy a prepaid phone and drove to a payphone outside an old diner where the locals barely looked up from their coffee. She called the police, not the local department. No, she called the county sheriff's office in a neighboring jurisdiction. She didn't tell them everything, just enough to plant the seed. My husband, she whispered. He's dangerous, and I have proof. She didn't wait for their questions. She hung up, drove to a new location, and ditched the payphone before anyone could trace it. Then she did something she never imagined she'd be capable of. She baited him. Elaine sent Thomas a message from the prepaid phone. Meet me at the old mill. Midnight. We end this. She stared at the screen, her hands trembling, then hit send. Minutes later, her phone buzzed. A reply. Finally, the old mill sat on the edge of town, a crumbling skeleton of rusted steel and shattered windows. It was the kind of place no one went anymore, the perfect stage for the nightmare her life had become. Elaine arrived early. She parked far enough away to avoid being seen and crept through the shadows, every step deliberate. She didn't bring the kitchen knife this time. Instead, she carried something else, a cheap voice recorder she'd bought from a pawn shop, tucked deep inside her jacket pocket. If Thomas confessed, if he said anything, she'd have proof. And maybe, just maybe, someone would finally believe her. Midnight came, and with it Thomas. His truck rumbled across the gravel, headlights cutting through the darkness like knives. He stepped out slow, the same unnerving calm in his movements. You never were good at hiding, he called out, his voice echoing through the empty mill. Elaine stayed in the shadows. You killed him, she said, her voice trembling but sharp. Thomas chuckled, low and cruel. You still on that? Jonah was nothing. Just a stray dog sniffing around what's mine. Yours. Elaine's nails dug into her palms. I'm not yours, Thomas. Not anymore. He tilted his head, as if amused. You think you get to decide that? You don't walk away from me, Elaine. No one does. And then he stepped closer. That was when she hit record. Tell me what you did, she said, forcing her voice steady. Thomas laughed, but it wasn't humor, it was contempt. You really want to hear it? Fine. I put him down like the worthless piece of trash he was. I cleaned it up. I made it disappear. And you know what? He smiled, slow and deliberate. I'd do it again. Elaine's blood ran cold, but she didn't move. She didn't even breathe, because in her pocket, the recorder captured every word. But then Thomas's smile faded. He'd noticed something. He was looking at her jacket, at the faint red glow of the recorder's light. Give it to me, he said, his voice sharp enough to cut glass. Elaine's heart hammered, and then she ran. The mill erupted with the sound of boots slamming against concrete, the rusted stairs trembling beneath her feet as she bolted for the upper levels. She didn't look back. She didn't have to. She could hear him. Elaine. His voice was a roar now, primal and furious. She reached the top, lungs burning, and darted across a narrow catwalk suspended above the mill's hollow center. The recorder was still clutched in her hand like a lifeline. Then she heard him. Closer. Faster. If he caught her, it was over. And then she saw it. A rusted ladder leading to the roof. She climbed, her hand slipping on the cold steel rungs, every nerve screaming. She pulled herself onto the roof, just as Thomas's hand swiped at her ankle. The wind howled around her, the ground far below, and for a brief, dizzying moment, Elaine thought she might fall. But then she turned. Thomas was there, his face twisted with rage, the monster he'd always been finally unmasked. Come here, he growled, stepping toward her. But this time she didn't run. She held up the recorder. I have everything, she said, her voice shaking but defiant. And if I don't make it out of here, this goes straight to the sheriff's office. Check the glove box of my car, Thomas. I made copies. For the first time, he hesitated. His eyes flickered uncertainty, anger, fear. And in that split second, Elaine saw it. The tiniest crack in his control. She didn't waste it. She swung the recorder like a weapon, smashing it against his temple. Thomas staggered backward, his boots scraping against the edge of the roof. For one terrifying second, Elaine thought he might fall, but he didn't. Instead, he laughed. You think this is over? He rasped. You have no idea what I've done. You think Jonah was the first. Elaine froze. What? Thomas grinned, teeth glinting in the moonlight. You really should have stayed in your lane, sweetheart. And then, before she could react, he lunged, grabbing her wrist and dragging her toward the edge. They struggled, their feet scraping against the rusted metal, neither of them willing to let go. And that's when she saw them, headlights. A car, pulling into the lot below. For one heartbeat, she didn't know if it was help, or something far worse. Thomas noticed too. His grip tightened. You tell a soul, he whispered, and I'll bury you next to him. Elaine stared into his eyes, and for the first time, she didn't feel fear. She felt fury. And then, she let go. Thomas stumbled back, losing his grip, just long enough for her to break free and run. She didn't stop. She didn't look back. She barreled down the stairs 2 at a time until she burst out into the gravel lot, right in front of a pair of headlights. And then a door opened. A man stepped out, sheriff's badge glinting in the light. Elaine Price, he called out. We got your call. Relief crashed through her like a wave. But as she turned, she saw it. Thomas, standing in the shadows of the mill entrance, smiling, because even as the sheriff approached, Thomas didn't run. He didn't have to, because in this town, Thomas Price still owned everything. And Elaine knew this was just the beginning. The sheriff's presence should have been her salvation. But the moment Elaine stepped into the fluorescent-lit station, she knew she was already losing. Thomas was there, not in cuffs, not even questioned. He stood with his arms folded, chatting with officers who greeted him, like an old friend. "Elaine," he said smoothly, flashing that same easy smile he wore at every church fundraiser and community meeting. "You didn't have to make this messy." Her fists clenched at her sides. "He confessed," she hissed. "I have it. The recorder." The sheriff cut her off, his voice calm but condescending. "Ma'am, we searched your car. No copies. Nothing in the glove box. Maybe you just imagined it." Elaine's stomach dropped. Thomas's smirk told her everything. He got into it. And now, standing in a room full of people who only saw the charming, dependable Thomas Price, she realized something terrifying. No one was coming to save her. By the next morning, the whispers had spread like wildfire. At the grocery store, women she'd known for years turned away when she walked past. At the diner, the waitress avoided her eyes. Even the pastor's wife muttered, "Poor Thomas, married to a woman like that." Thomas hadn't just discredited her. He'd poisoned the town against her. And worst of all, they believed him. That night, alone in her car with the doors locked, Elaine stared at her reflection in the rearview mirror and felt something inside her shift. She was done begging for help, done hoping someone would see the truth. If Thomas wanted a game, she was done playing defense. From this moment on, she was the hunter. Elaine spent the next 3 days gathering everything she could. Receipts from the storage facility, security camera footage from nearby businesses, bank statements Thomas didn't know she could access. And then she found it. A record from the storage unit's security logs. The night Jonah disappeared, Thomas's keycard had been used at 2:14 a.m., the same night Thomas had told her he'd been working late. Elaine stared at the timestamp until her hands stopped trembling. She finally had him, but evidence wouldn't be enough. Not in a town that worshipped Thomas Price. She needed to break him, and to do that, she'd have to make him slip. On a cold Friday night, Elaine sent him one last message. "Meet me, the old mill. One last time. No police." For a moment, she almost hoped he wouldn't answer. But then, like clockwork, his reply came. "I'll enjoy this." The mill was darker this time, its broken windows black against the moonlight. Elaine waited inside, hidden behind a rusted column, her phone recording every second. When Thomas arrived, his footsteps echoed like gunshots in the empty space. "You never learn, do you?" His voice carried a cruel amusement. "You could have come home, Elaine. We could have fixed this." She stepped out from the shadows. "You killed him, and you think you'll get away with it." Thomas chuckled, slow and mocking. "I already have." But that was when Elaine smiled. "Not this time." And she tossed a folder of evidence onto the floor between them. Bank statements, camera footage, the storage logs. Thomas's smirk faltered, just slightly. "You can't prove anything," he said, but his voice had lost that easy calm. "I don't need to prove it," Elaine whispered. "I just need you to say it again." And then she held up her phone, its red recording light glowing like a flare. Thomas froze. For one split second, the mask slipped, and the monster underneath came out. "You think you're clever?" he snarled, stepping closer, his voice raw with fury. "You think anyone's going to believe the woman who couldn't even keep her husband happy? I'll bury you, Elaine, like I buried him." And there it was, the confession. Clear, cold, unmistakable. Elaine didn't run this time. She didn't even flinch. She just pressed send, forwarding the recording to the one place Thomas could never reach, the sheriff's direct line. The sound of sirens came fast. For the first time, Thomas's confidence cracked. He spun, his eyes wide, as flashing blue lights lit up the mill's broken windows. Elaine didn't move. She didn't gloat. She just stared at him. Because this wasn't a victory. Not yet. This was survival. The deputies swarmed him, shouting commands. For a second, Thomas looked at her, that familiar smirk twitching back into place, as if to say, "This isn't over." But this time it was. When they dragged him away in cuffs, Thomas didn't look so untouchable anymore. He just looked small. Days later, when the news spread, the town didn't know what to do with itself. The man they'd all trusted, the man they'd all defended, was a murderer. And Elaine, She was no longer the woman who had been whispered about in grocery store aisles. She was the woman who had faced a monster and won, but the price was written all over her face. The sleepless nights, the grief for Jonah, the ache of betrayal that would never quite leave her. Standing in her kitchen, staring at the first sunrise that felt like hers in months, Elaine finally understood something. Survival isn't about being fearless. It's about fighting even when you are. And that's the lesson, isn't it? Evil doesn't always look like a stranger in the dark. Sometimes, it looks like the person sitting across the dinner table. And when no one believes you, you learn to believe in yourself. If you were Elaine, would you have run? Or would you have fought back? Tell me in the comments. And if you were holding your breath through this story, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. Because the next story might just be even darker than this one. And trust me, you won't want to miss it.